Hey there, Alpine Church and friends and everyone who's watching this. I'm Ross Anderson. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Alpine Church, and I wanted to share with you a devotional that hopefully is encouraging to you today. You know, during this time of pandemic, a lot of us have suffered losses of different kinds. It might be simple losses on a smaller scale, like we've lost some things that were meaningful to us. We've lost our ordinary patterns of life. Maybe if you're a hugger, you've lost the opportunity to connect with people, or maybe something even greater like the wedding plans that you had, or the trip you were going to go on, or the concert you were going to attend, or maybe you've lost your job. My daughter hasn't worked in 6 or 7 weeks, or maybe your health, or maybe someone that you love has died or is threatened with death because of this coronavirus. We've all been through loss, and the normal human response to loss is grief or sadness. I want to share with you today what the Bible has to say about grief, and to give you an overarching perspective on grief, that if you're a follower of Jesus, that grief is going to look different, because we don't grieve without hope. Now, first of all, I want you to understand that it's not a sin to be sad. And the Bible gives us lots of examples of godly people who experience sadness, including Jesus himself. Jesus wept at the death of his friend. And that becomes confusing for us sometimes, because we're told that, hey, we should just be trusting God, that we should be joyful. And yet joy and grief are not opposites. And I'd like to go into more detail on that, but you'll have to go to look at the resources on joy that are available at pursuegod.org to find out more about joy and biblical joy and what it really means. But God uses grief and times of grief and sorrow and times of loss in our lives to do a lot of things that maybe wouldn't happen in our lives when things are going along easy and good. But having said that, I want you to understand a couple of grief strategies the Bible talks about, but then the main thing I want to get to is this overarching perspective. You know, the Bible tells us that, hey, we can turn to God at any time in our loss and grief. It tells us that it's okay to express and to feel our emotions. It tells us that we need to take rest. The Bible builds this idea of Sabbath, that we need to get some rest, and even more so when you're grieving, because it just saps your energy and your strength. And the Bible tells us that we ought to engage with people. Romans 12 says, weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. And so we want to be engaging with people. But beyond specific tips, I want to give you this overarching perspective about grief, that it doesn't matter what happens, and maybe you're not suffering a lot of loss during this pandemic time. Bless you, but you will at some time in your life. It's part of the human condition, that whatever happens, that God himself is enough. That's what I want you to walk away with today. Whatever happens, God himself is enough. Now, when God is in the picture, grief is different. And so in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says, I don't want you to be uninformed about those who have fallen asleep in death. For we grieve, he says, but we don't grieve without hope. The difference for Christians is that even when we're going through tough times, our grief is always laced with hope. And the hope is based on who God is in our life. So number one, we have hope in grief because God promises to be present. It doesn't feel like God is present maybe, but King David, who went through a lot of grief in his life, he said in Psalm 34 verse 18, he said, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. That's what he learned in his times of grief. That I know when we're grieving, it feels like God might be just like a universe away. But when I invite him into that place of my sorrow, when I invite him into that place of my brokenness, he's there. He promises to be there. And I personally find the presence of God most compelling when I open up his word. The Bible's like a love letter to us from God. I open up his word and I read the Psalms, which are so emotionally expressive, or I read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because that's where Jesus is found most compellingly. And I find that God meets me there and he's present. And then the second thing we see is we have hope in grief because God promises to comfort and support us. And so in Psalm 147, it says, he heals the brokenhearted and bandages their wounds. So obviously, these aren't physical wounds, But God takes the broken pieces of our heart and he gently and tenderly knits them back together again in his own time, in his own way. And so that we may never forget the things that we went through and the losses that we suffered, but God heals. And Jesus said that in like this in Matthew chapter 5. He said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted." And so God comforts us through his presence. He comforts us when we know that he's at work in our trials and our adversity. And he comforts us through people that God brings into our lives to care for us. But part of the comfort is also that we have a bright future. And this is the third reason why God himself is enough, because we have hope in our grief, because God promises to turn our fortunes around. I may not do it in this life. You know, different people, we see it in the Bible that some people were blessed by God. They were grieving a loss, and God brought back into their life something to replace what they had lost. But others, that never happened in this life. And so we can't always expect God to restore our fortunes in the here and now, or to do it in a way that we think he ought to do. But we know this is part of our hope, is we know that this life is not all there is. And one day all things will be made new. And no matter what chaos brings in this life, that, you know, all of it's going to be gone one day. And so Revelation chapter 21 verse 4 says that he will wipe every tear from our eyes, and there'll be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. So no matter, you might have cried a river in this life, but one day there'll be no more tears for those who belong to Jesus. You know, life's sorrows and losses and pains might have hit you like a truck in this life, but one day those are going to be gone for those who belong to Jesus. So I want to encourage you that if you've entrusted your life and your eternity to him, then these promises are yours. Now, if you haven't, then if you're holding Jesus at arm's length, then the promises that God brings in our life, they come through him. And so as long as he's at arm's length, then his promises are just out of reach for you. But when you have given your life to him and you belong to him, then you have every reason that whatever chaos brings, whenever it brings loss in our lives, that we can rely fully on him. And so I hope that you've come to the place to realize that whatever's happening, that God himself is enough for you, that he's present with you, that he's working in your life, that he's bringing something good out of the trial, that he's going to make everything right one day. And so that in Jesus, you can really trust in him. Now, I hope you'll spend some time talking with someone about these. We're going to go into this in more depth on Sunday in our service. This is our topic about how to grieve in chaos. But I hope you'll find a way to talk in your small group or in your family with people, other people, about how to cope with loss and grief that we all might be going through at this time. Thanks for watching today.